points, 49 for Clinton, 37 for Trump. The numbers we released today are no better for the Republican presumptive nominee. 66% of the likely voters in our poll said they had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. ABC News Washington Post national poll has that number a little higher. It's 70% unfavorable. When we asked voters if they would ever consider voting for Trump, 55% said never. These polls add to what has been a tsunami of negative headlines for Trump over the past 24 hours about the state of his campaign, his response to the Orlando massacre, and his ongoing war with news organizations. If you work for the Trump campaign, let's just say it has not been a very good day to sit by the telly.
From Muslims to the media, the latest Trump comments that have Republican leaders squirming.
And new numbers this morning. Do they spell trouble for Trump?
A new Bloomberg poll shows a major decline for Donald Trump, now trailing Hillary Clinton nationally by double digits. But that's not even the worst part for Trump. An overwhelming 55% of those polled say they could never vote for Trump, as well as 63% of women say that they could never support him.
The polls that just recently came out show Donald Trump with a 70% unfavorable rating. Nobody has ever gotten elected president of the United States with a 70% unfavorable
that's the newest
rating.
These have been the stories. People don't like what they're hearing. They have started to turn against him. A significant number have started to turn against him.
And then there's Trump's latest fight with members of the media.
Mistake for Trump to ban Washington Post, yes or no?
It's a mistake. It sounds like Nixon's enemy list.
Okay. It's been a lot of controversy, and you see his numbers have gone south, and that 5.5-point lead, not only is that pretty significant for Hillary Clinton, the trend here is what's really got to be troubling for Donald Trump. And as we say, it has been a month of controversy.
After Trump's comments yesterday, you now have the top Republicans, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, agreeing with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton about his comments on Muslims.
What do you believe is going through Paul Ryan's mind now? Is it that the party doesn't have a plan B? What is it?
That's some bad information flow for the Republican. Donald Trump seems to realize that he's a man somewhat alone on an island right now. In a rally in Atlanta today, he made it clear that being alone on that island is A-OK with him.
You know, the Republicans, honestly, folks, our leaders have to get tougher. This is too tough to do it alone. But you know what? I think I'm going to be forced to. I think I'm going to be forced to. Our leaders have to get a lot tougher. And be quiet. Just please be quiet. Don't talk. Please be quiet. Just be quiet to the leaders. Because they have to get tougher. They have to get sharper. They have to get smarter. We have to have our Republicans either stick together or let me just do it by myself. I'll do very well. I'm going to do very well. Okay?
So, John, based on our poll and everything else and Trump's attitude as reflected there, how big are his current troubles?
They're pretty big. They're pretty big, and I think actually that reaction today is maybe the deepest trouble of all. You and I hear from people every day on Twitter and other places who cast around aspersions on Trump and say he suffers from narcissistic personality disorder. That display right there, the notion that you can go it alone, that you can become the president of the United States as the nominee of the Republican Party with no help from anyone, it's all me, it's all going to be me, it's not in touch with reality. It's not in touch with reality, and being not in touch with reality makes it very hard to win a presidential race.
I don't care how sympathetic one is to this notion that Trump plays by different rules and the establishment doesn't get it. He has lost a lot of news cycles in a row at a time when Hillary Clinton's had to deal with her email problem, when there's some bad job numbers. He is losing news cycles, and Republicans are noticing as much as anybody else. People are going to make a snap judgment that the race is over, that Trump can't fight back. There's a lot of time left in this race, but where he is right now is in a very bad place, and nothing he's done this week so far, halfway through the week, has turned things around.
Right, and let's be clear. We saw back when we first started polling Trump's numbers back in the summer, almost a year ago, Trump had very bad numbers, and he improved them over months. He improved them, though, in the context of a Republican nomination fight where there were questions about his tenor, about his temperament among voters, but not about his basic policy stances. Those were not really, the Republicans basically agreed with him about a lot of things. Now you're in this general election context, much bigger electorate, a lot of available voters out there who right now, they're not on Trump's side necessarily on policy. They're trying to figure it out. And the things that he's said and done over the last month have, I think, there's a good case to make that they may at least have turned those people off possibly permanently.
And he turned things around when he was running against an overmatched field. It was a big field, but it was overmatched. Now he's running against two people, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who can command the stage just as much as he can. He's got a big problem.
He's got a very big problem. All right, Donald Trump's dubious week may be even more dire than the national poll numbers suggest. All eyes are now on those Republican leaders whom Trump seemed to be telling to be quiet today, notably Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, who are laboring mightily to protect their party's majorities in the House and Senate. Neither of those Republican leaders has lately heeded Trump's advice to shush. Instead, they've repeatedly been critical of Trump's rhetoric since they endorsed him last month, and both dodged questions about him yesterday, making it clear that they are not going to weigh in on the presidential race every time the presumptive Republican nominee says something controversial. So with all of that in mind, we've decided, in our thinking about this, to call the main sources of Trump's travails the 3 Ds. There's the data, especially private polling, of Trump's effect on down-ballot races. There are the donors, those big dollar backers who have so far stayed largely on the sidelines. And then there's the ongoing dissension, third D, within Trump's campaign. So, Mark, let's start with the first D. What kind of data, beyond public poll numbers that we've talked about and have you seen, including our new poll, what kind of private poll numbers are spooking Republicans?
There was a period when a Republican congressional leader said, you know what, Trump may win, he may not, he probably won't, but we're going to get a lot of donations from people who don't give it to Trump, and we're going to support our majorities. Now they're beginning to see, with Trump's national numbers starting to infect down-ballot races, they're going to poll a lot in the next week and see how this is affecting things. The minute Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan think that Trump is going to cost them their majorities, their view of the world changes dramatically. They're beginning to hear from people that it might, and now they may become a reality. And if that becomes a reality before the convention, with enough time to try to stop Trump at the convention, I believe McConnell and Ryan could well move to do that.
Change the rules. You know, we're hearing a lot of that talk. It's gone in waves, the talk about the dump Trump movement and what you would have to do to change the rules to stop him from being the nominee. It's now peaking again. We're hearing it a lot around. Whether it can happen or not, we don't know, but there's a lot of people talking about it. The trouble for Republicans as they look at these numbers is that if they embrace Trump, they're worried about getting dragged down. And if they distance themselves, as a lot of them have, they're still now starting to see themselves be dragged down. That's a horrible catch-22. I run away from the nominee, I lose. I embrace the nominee, I lose. That's why it leads a lot of people to start thinking that what would otherwise be unthinkable 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out for the Republican
convention. A Senate candidate can fight and survive a down-ballot win a down-ballot victory if the top of the ticket loses a state by 5, 6, 7. You start getting above 7 points, there's no Senate candidate who can survive that. And you look at House races and people say, oh, there's 25, 30 seats max in play. No. If Trump's going to lose by the kind of numbers we have him at in our poll, they're going to bring some races into play that no one's thinking about, just like in a normal tsunami year.
50-44, survivable. 50-41, 50-40. Everybody's going down.
Say goodbye to the majorities, and they're worried about that. All right, let's move to the second D. John, what is going on with the Republican donor class?
Well, you know, it seems to me that there are 2 different categories. There are Republican donors who got on the Trump bandwagon reluctantly and now are having a lot of second thoughts about it and are not enthused, not like wanting to put their shoulders in the wheel and are worried. And then there are all those who were sufficiently concerned before to not get on the bandwagon. Those people, from what I can tell, none of them have any plans to join up with the Trump forces anytime in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Some of the donors have been charmed by Trump, I'm told, and they like him and they've gotten to know him a little bit, and they're not trying to stand up to him. There's a group of people who were hoping to use the leverage of the donors, but Trump gave a speech last Tuesday, which if he would give every day and not make controversial statements, the donors would be happy with. But they are freaked out by his lack of discipline and the lack of the inability of Reince Priebus and others to have influence over Trump's behavior. The donor class, as I said earlier, they're not going to give to down-ballot races if they think it's a lost cause. So they are now currently feeling as negatively about Trump as a group, not everybody, but overall, as anybody in the party.
Right, and that just feeds back into the thing we talked about at the beginning, which is talking about the McConnell and Ryan conundrum, right? Because if a situation where donors think that it's that Trump will lose, but it's survivable in the House and Senate, they'll just take all their money, not give it to Trump, but give it to these down ballot races. But if they start to see this as the Titanic or the Lusitania or something, they just like sit on their wallets. They're rich guys. They're happy to just like keep their wallets and their checkbooks closed, and that becomes just part of a negative cycle that makes losing the House and Senate more likely.
And based on what Trump's already done, assuming he makes no additional mistakes, I think after Bernie Sanders is out of the race, you're going to see some prominent Republican donors giving money to Hillary Clinton, raising money for Hillary Clinton.
All right, so let me get to the third D, and that is dissension. We talked about that. We've had a lot of reports from dissension within the Trump campaign. How much do you think that is playing into Trump's current woes?
It's a big problem. Look, all campaigns go through rough spots, and when they do, smart campaigns reach out. You saw when the Clinton campaign was having trouble, regular pilgrimage to Capitol Hill by Robbie Mook, John Podesta, Jennifer Palmieri, to hold people's hands, to get the bedwetters to put on some diapers, maybe place some plastic sheeting down on the bed. So even if they wet the bed, there was some protection.
That's a horrible image. Thank you for giving us
the Trump campaign, disarray and confusion right now. Which is their super PAC? How are they organizing states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things, that disarray is freaking people out, because when a campaign's going through turbulence, you want to see some stability, you want to see some comedy, some cohesiveness. People aren't sensing that, and it's freaking people out and frustrating them.
Corey Lewandowski, Paul Manafort, let's just say those two guys, most influential people in Trump's world. If you talk to Corey Lewandowski's friends, you talk to Paul Manafort's friends, none of them will say to you, we look in your eye, look you in your eye and say, my guy's running the show. None of them. No one knows. No matter who you side with, no one confidently asserts they know who's running the campaign at this point. And most of them won't even say that there's really a campaign.
If the Trump
those are their friends.
If the Trump campaign could reassure Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, the donors, we're going to pick a great running mate, we're going to have a great convention, we're going to be really prepared for the debates, that would settle people down. But the confusion within the campaign is not giving people confidence that they're going to hit the marks on those very big moments.
The people around Donald Trump couldn't stop him from doing some of the damage he's done in these last couple of weeks. Who's going to stop him?
Yep.
Who's going to stop
All right. In the wake of the Orlando attack, Democrats are gearing up now for another big fight over gun safety, gun control. We'll talk more about what happened in the Senate today with a filibuster after this quick word from our sponsors.
After the Orlando shooting on Sunday, talk immediately turned to the potential effects that attack might have on America's war on terror, LGBT rights, and gun control. But as the week has unfolded, it's the battle over guns that seems to be getting the most attention. On Monday night, during a moment of silence on the House floor to remember the Orlando victims, a handful of Democrats walked out to protest the blocking of gun control legislation. Today, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "I will be meeting with the NRA, who has endorsed me, about not allowing people on the terrorist watch list or the no-fly list to buy guns," end quote. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats, led by Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, spent the afternoon filibustering a spending bill in an attempt to add amendments that would close the gun show loophole and prevent people on the government's no-fly list from purchasing firearms. Here's Murphy earlier today talking about the Newtown elementary school shooting that occurred in his state in 2012.
As someone who represents the community of Sandy Hook, which is still grieving today, I'm going to stand on this floor and talk about our experience in Sandy Hook, Orlando's experience, the need to come together on this issue of making sure that dangerous people who have designs on mass murder don't get dangerous weapons, as long as I can, so that we can give time to try to figure out a path forward.
Mark, Vice President Biden is expected to deliver a speech in Sandy Hook tonight. So my question, as we take all this in, is whether this is just another temporary skirmish in the gun control battle, or is this potentially a leading indicator of a meaningful change when it comes to gun rights?
I think this is a pretty big moment. I don't want to overstate it, but you now have congressional Democrats being as aggressive, mirroring Hillary Clinton, who's the most aggressive gun control advocate as a presidential candidate. You now have Democrats in Congress being pretty aggressive. I'm not sure what the Trump tweet means entirely, but it does suggest that if Hillary Clinton wins the White House, if Democrats take the Senate, and if they eat into the House majority, that Hillary Clinton has a chance to claim a mandate to try to pass some gun control measures, and that would be quite different than her predecessor, Democratic predecessors, to start the administration that way.
I think that's true, and we were saying that earlier this week, that there some things could fall into place that would change the calculus. I think in the more immediate term, it's interesting to me. We don't know what the Trump tweet means. That is one thing. It's also the case that Mitch McConnell came out yesterday and made some comments about the fact that he might, first time I've ever heard McConnell say that he would be open to at least considering some kind of gun control change. I think it's not impossible. It's a low probability, but it's not impossible that on a couple of these issues, particularly on the no-fly, that we could actually get actual legislation passed on this in the next few weeks. It's possible.
Yeah, I think you get something through the Senate. I don't think you get it through the House. No. But getting it through the Senate would be a big win. And what I'm saying is, I don't think anything will pass until next year, if at all. But I think there's a chance Democrats will now push this for momentum.
Oh, I think that's right. I think you're going to see, again, Hillary Clinton leading the charge. I think this is, this is a different issue than it has been for 20 years now, with someone at the top of the ticket really pushing it.
Yeah. All right. Even Donald Trump's allies have now admitted that the presumptive GOP nominee has had a not-so-stellar month. Hillary Clinton's campaign could choose to sit back in its Brooklyn headquarters and just wait and watch while their opponent self-destructs. Instead, Clinton's been pretty aggressive. She's gone to battleground states. She's kept the pressure up on her Republican rival. She did it again today while talking about national security at the Air and Space Center in Hampton, Virginia.
So not one of Donald Trump's reckless ideas would have saved a single life in Orlando. It's just more evidence that he is temperamentally unfit and totally unqualified to be commander-in-chief.
So Clinton's done an interview with USA Today in which she's talked about a speech she's going to give next week, staying on the offensive on Trump, on the economy, saying he's unfit to be the steward of the American economy. What can she do during this period to take advantage aggressively of Trump's current problems?
I think she's doing it. You saw it yesterday. I think, if I were a Democratic master strategist and I could coordinate everything, I'd have Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama on a series of issues, hammering Trump, being in the news, doing it in tandem, and going after trying to turn every policy issue into a character issue. And the way that Trump's been behaving lately, if he reacts the way he has been reacting on so many things, he'll give them plenty of fodder.
Yeah, I'd say three things, and again, they're doing all of them, but I'll highlight them. One is her performance continues to be so much better than it was.
Yep.
No more shouting, confident discussion of Trump. I think if she can just keep that performance level up and get into debates that way and the convention that way, make a huge difference. Second is the battleground states, focusing on data, having her campaign be ready to have operations that Trump isn't going to be able to match in the battleground states. That can be worth several points in a close race. And finally, Republicans, the courting of Republicans, now that Sanders is easing out of the race, figuring out how to time the announcement of support, not just of national figures, but prominent people in the battleground states, local officials, business leaders in, say, Ohio, Florida, etc. It's going to be a backbreaking thing because it's going to get a ton of attention when it happens.
I believe that priorities has been up now for almost a month with advertising in a lot of battleground states, almost entirely unanswered by Trump. The Clinton campaign is going to go up on the air there, too, pretty soon, and that's another thing that could make a difference.
Yep.
Right. While Donald Trump has been taking his pretty long turn in the barrel, it's hard to imagine that the 5 months between now and November will go without Hillary Clinton having a few bad weeks of her own. In public polls, her negatives are not quite as bad as Trump's, but still pretty high. 54% of voters in our Bloomberg Politics poll had an unfavorable view of the presumptive Democratic nominee, while 55% said the same thing in the ABC News Washington Post survey. Mark, so knowing what we know, flip this coin around, what are the things that might likely happen, most likely things that could happen that would send Hillary Clinton into the barrel, either her own barrel or along with Donald Trump in the barrel?
I'll tell you, the biggest threat to her is the press favoring Trump. And I thought that in the general election, that might be a big advantage for him. Banning the Washington Post, from these events and behaving the way he is on a variety of issues that offend the sensibilities of a lot of news organizations and reporters, chances are lower that her winning streak is going to end anytime soon. Obviously, the email controversy, the FBI investigation is a potential thing that could put her in the barrel. The other thing would be another scandal involving the Clintons or the Clinton Foundation. Right. And then I think a gaffe of huge proportions. But I will say, Hillary Clinton hates being in the barrel. She feels put upon.
She's not been gaffing much lately either.
But I'm telling you, I'm sure it'll happen. But I'm not sure it's going to happen before the convention, given how careful they're being both careful and aggressive.
The email thing, we've talked about it endlessly, but I can't help but find some sympathy or some sense of agreement with those who yesterday, seeing the data breach revealed at the DNC, that Russian hackers had gotten into the Democratic National Committee's computer systems, as raising a huge red flag around Hillary Clinton's email. We've wondered whether that server has been secure or not. The fact that the DNC's computer was breached, I think, raises again the question of whether hers has been breached. We don't know. But if you're asking what could send her back in the barrel, if that turned out to be true and stuff was compromised, she'd be back in the barrel again.
Yeah, it's like banking the whole thing like they banked the whole last election on Benghazi.
Yeah.
Up next, a Republican ad maker and a Hillary Clinton supporter walk into a studio to talk about Donald Trump. That's not the beginning of a joke. Rather, it's our next segment. We'll be right back. Joining us now, the former Democratic congressman from Tennessee and a big Hillary Clinton supporter. Before that was a totally cool thing to do, Harold Ford Jr. And in Santa Barbara, California, joined by the Republican media consultant and the strategist par excellence, Fred Davis. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I want to start with the big 30,000-foot question first to you, Fred. Is the press overstating Donald Trump's current predicaments, or is things pretty bad?
Oh, it hasn't been his best week. It hasn't been his best couple of weeks. I think we all would agree on that. But I think what's been overstated is that this is going to last forever. I think they'll get their act together. I think Corey and Paul will eventually work together fine. And I think he's going to be the nominee and will come out of the convention a much stronger little party than you see right now.
Harold, if Secretary Clinton said to you, you know, obviously Trump's not having a great time, but what should I be worried about? What should she be worried about?
I think she's handled this week well. I think she'd had to do two things. One, not allow Donald Trump to dominate every news cycle, and she's getting her message out. Yeah. Two, she was able to engage President Obama very early, whether the president's worried about legacy, whether he's worried about many of his achievements being undone, whatever the case may be. She got the president basically in mid-season form in June. I didn't expect to see him at this level of involvement, in this aggressive level of involvement, perhaps until mid-September.
Right, that's a very smart answer, but non-responsive. Is there anything she should be worried about now?
Oh, no. So I was going to, on Fred's point, I think this is going to be a long race. I don't view this as, I would agree with Fred, this is not a decisive week. It's been a very good week. But as Donald Trump has proven, he is resilient. And his supporters, continue to read data where so many of his supporters continue to stand with him. So it's early. I still think she has advantage, and I'm biased about this, but I think this is going to be a long race. And for anyone in the Clinton campaign to believe for one moment that this 1 week will decide this, I think is misguided at worst.
Okay, Harold and Fred are going to stay with us. We're going to come back. We've got a lot more from our Bloomberg Politics national poll where we asked likely voters who they think the nominees should pick as their running mates. We're going to talk about those names as well as more deep inside the data about Trump and Clinton right after this.
We are back with Republican media consultant and very handsome man, Fred Davis, former Tennessee congressman and Clinton supporter, and marginally less handsome man, Harold Ford.
Thank you, John.
Thank you guys for sticking around. I want to ask Fred, we did this Bloomberg Politics national poll we've been talking about, and one of the things we asked the poll respondents was who their picks were for their party nominees. The list of potential running mates for Donald Trump, I'm going to give you the top four, all right, Fred, and I'm going to get your reaction to this. Newt Gingrich at 29%, Marco Rubio at 24%, John Kasich at 18%, and Chris Christie at 9%. So what do you think of the idea of Newt Gingrich as Donald Trump's running mate?
I love Newt. I think he's a man of great ideas. I think what Donald Trump, I think his strength is as a chief, as the chairman of the board, the guy that gets out and gets to use the bully pulpit all over America. But he needs somebody back home that's an operating officer. Of that list, I would have, of course, I'm prejudiced as well, but I would put Kasich at the top of my list of somebody who's proven he can actually get things done and work on both sides of the aisle while Donald is out being Donald.
Fred, on the basis of what you know about John Kasich, do you think he'd take that gig if he were offered it?
I don't think he would. I wish he would. We haven't talked about it, but I think he made his peace with his run for presidency and is really happy to be back in Ohio.
Harold, the Democrats would be completely afraid if Newt Gingrich got on the ticket, wouldn't they?
I think there would be, what, 6 or 7 marriages on that ticket alone if the two of them were together. So I agree with Fred's characterization of Newt. I served with him. I think he's a very smart guy. But I think Fred's probably right about the kind of needs that Donald Trump has, and it's unclear to me if Newt would fit that role right.
All right, so we asked about the potential running mates for Hillary Clinton. Elizabeth Warren, it was a top choice, 35% of Democrats. Cory Booker, 17%. Not sure, Senator Not Sure, 15%, and Julian Castro, Secretary Castro, 12%. So Elizabeth Warren, obviously the top choice of Democrats. I believe for a while there's virtually no chance that Hillary Clinton would pick her, but that suggests pretty popular support.
She's indicated, Mrs. Clinton has indicated that she will keep an open mind on all these folks. I don't know Senator Warren very well. She clearly, I think, early on the campaign leveled the most effective critique of Donald Trump and continued, I think, follow with an equally impressive one. I know Cory Booker, former mayor, could help manage, could certainly help relations in the Congress. I don't know Secretary Castro, but I do know Tim Kaine, who also think will, and Sherrod Brown as well, whom I think would bring a lot to the ticket geographically and would help Mrs. Clinton shore up some constituency supports that we didn't have as strongly as we wanted during the primary.
Congressman Ford, I'm going to ask you to do something that is not going to make you comfortable because you are an elusive man on some matters. Who do you think would be the best vice presidential pick for Hillary Clinton? I know you think they're all, you named a bunch of people you think would be good, but who'd be the best? Who'd be your advice?
Look, I think all these folks would be good. The challenge is who helps her win and who helps her with constituencies we need the most help with. I think Tim Kaine, Sherrod Brown, and Cory Booker, and Elizabeth Warren certainly drives the fire in the party. But if you look at geography, I think those three guys bring a lot to the table.
Fred, we asked about the Republican brand in our poll. 32% said a favorable view of the Republican brand, 62% unfavorable. Is Donald Trump helping or hurting the Republican brand right now, do you think?
I think he's changing the Republican brand. It remains to be seen whether it's helping or hurting. It's probably hurting right, this week. Of course, it's hurting a little bit. But in the long run, I'm of the feeling that he is bringing new people and new excitement to the Republican Party that it's a party that's been a little confused through the primary process. And I think there's a clarity there, and whether the establishment likes the clarity or not, we'll see how it turns out. But I think it's a possible positive.
Fred, does it not worry you today? We played earlier in the show Donald Trump saying today, basically, I may have to go it alone here. I don't care about, if I have to do this on my own, I'll do it on my own. Republican leaders should just be quiet, he said, and let me get on with the business of running for president. I don't need them. I can do this on my own. Is that a sensible strategy or a way of looking at the world when you're a major party nominee?
Well, it probably wouldn't have been my advice to him. But, you know what it's like in that seat. And with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and people who are very sharp, very good establishment politicians nipping at your heels, what are you going to do? Donald Trump's not the type to sit back and say, yes, yes, let me fall in line. That's not why people like him. He's out there fighting for his every breath, and I think he'll continue to do that. And I think that's part of his unusual popularity.
Fred, if you were sitting in a meeting with Mitch McConnell and the pollster for the committee, the Senate committee came in and said, Senator, if Donald Trump is at the top of the ticket, we will lose the Senate majority. And Senator McConnell said to you, Fred, what should we do? What would you advise he do?
I would say we need to change that dynamic and get on board. I think I agree with Harold. I think that Hillary and Obama have made a great tag team this week. And the Democrat part, you know, nobody's overly elated in America about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. Their negatives are too high. But the Democrats have done a far better job of coalescing behind him, or behind her, I'm sorry, and moving forward. And I think it's about time for the Republicans to do the same. I'll probably get 1,000 phone calls for that when the show's over, but that would be my advice.
Harold, in a USA Today interview, Secretary Clinton refused to commit to keeping Debbie Wasserman Schultz on as chair of the committee after she becomes the official nominee. What are the politics of that answer?
Well, I've been a believer I've said repeatedly, I think that the chairwoman made things messier than it should have been. She had every right to profess her support for Mrs. Clinton, but as the party chair, I think Bernie Sanders, there was some credence to what he was saying. Look, if we reach a point where the only way we're able to keep harmony at the convention is for Debbie Wasserman Schultz not to be the chairwoman, you elevate a Donna Brazile or someone to run the convention, electing Hillary Clinton is the most important thing the Democratic Party should be focused on. So I don't have any issues with what Mrs. Clinton is saying.
I'm going to ask you to do something that you also isn't going to come naturally to you, but just pretend like you're Bernie Sanders' chief advisor right now. What would you tell Sanders to do today from Sanders' point of view, not from Hillary Clinton's point of view, but from his own point of view?
To begin to draft a speech and talk about the importance of income inequality and how you raise these issues, and you believe the Democratic Party is at the center and the core of resolving this issue. You had your battle with Mrs. Clinton. Mrs. Clinton won fairly in this race, and you look forward to working with her. I would cite 2 or 3 instances in which you worked with her in the Senate on things that were very important, not only to the party, but to the country. And let's move forward and make clear we head into this convention unified. It appears that there's going to continue to be fissures with the Republicans. What we need to do is not only enter the convention unified, but leave it equally, if not equally unified, if not even stronger.
All right. Fred Davis, a great man. Harold Ford, an adequate man.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're both fantastic. Love having you on the show. Come back soon. Coming up, we'll have more from our new Bloomberg Politics national poll. John McCormick and NBC's Casey Hunt will join us next. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
us now to talk more about our new Bloomberg Politics national poll, our colleague John McCormick, who has dug through the numbers and written them up, and you can read his stories, 2 stories, on BloombergPolitics.com right now. He is in our Chicago bureau. John, talk about this issue of brand that we asked Fred Davis about how the two parties' brands are doing, which obviously creates the environment for this election.
Yeah, well, I think this poll, offers some real concrete evidence that Donald Trump is not doing anything positive for the Republican brand right now. As you've maybe discussed, only about a third of Americans right now view the Republican brand in a favorable way, and that is the lowest level we've recorded in a Bloomberg poll since the poll's inception in 2009.
And how's the Democratic brand doing?
Much better. I mean, not great, but about half of Americans view the Democratic Party in a favorable light. So that obviously sets up the contours for this race, both at the presidential level and obviously could also affect races, congressional races and down ballot races for governorships, et cetera.
John, I'm going to ask you to go just beyond the confines of the poll in one respect. I'm struck by the wrong track number in this poll, which is very, very high, 68%. Say that the country's on the wrong track. The wrong track number has been over 50% for a long time. It didn't stop Barack Obama from getting reelected in 2012. But it's a strange thing to me that the wrong track number is that high and Barack Obama's approval rating is now well over 50%. How do we reconcile those realities in the electorate?
Yeah, no, it really is a stark contrast, and it seemingly would be an environment that Donald Trump could take advantage of if things were going better for his campaign right now, that so many Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. That number is at the highest levels, again, that we've recorded in the Bloomberg poll going back to 2010, 2009. And so it's an atmosphere where a challenger to the incumbent party seemingly would have an advantage. At the same time, we also ask people about sort of their economic and personal situation in life. And for the first time since we started asking the question in 2010, a majority of Americans say they actually are better off. They feel better off right now than they did at the peak of the recession in early 2009. So people personally are feeling better about their situation, and yet there's a very widely held belief that the country's heading in the wrong direction.
As we said yesterday, part of this poll, the bulk of it was done before the Orlando massacre, but there's some of it from after, so the data is going to be a little bit mixed. But talk about what issues were the top issues for voters in our survey.
Yeah, well, jobs and the economy is almost always the top issue that people list when we give them a choice to pick from in terms of what issue they think is most important in the election. So that was about a fifth of the electorate. Americans said that jobs and the economy was the top issue. But when you combine terrorism and ISIS, the number approaches and actually surpasses jobs in the economy just slightly. And so we did see a tick up in those numbers following the terrorist attack in Orlando. And so, we'll see how this plays out over the coming weeks. But, at least initially, people are, at a heightened level of concern when it comes to terrorism, as would be expected.
John, we just talked with Fred Davis and Harold Ford about the vice presidential element of this poll. Just walk us through that a little bit. To me, if I look at those numbers, the running mates for Trump, potential running mates for Clinton, the fact that 15% of the Democrats of voters say that they're not sure who Hillary Clinton's running mate should be is sort of striking, given that it sort of suggests that there's a little bit of a thinness on the Democratic bench as she starts to cast about and think about who she should put on the ticket. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, about a third of the people supporting Clinton at this point think that she should pick Elizabeth Warren as her running mate, as I'm sure you guys discussed.
Right.
But it's, one person we didn't ask about was Bernie Sanders. And while it seems highly unlikely that she will pick Sanders as her running mate, if we had him on the list, I'm sure he would have gotten a large share of the vote as well. We tried to put people on the list who we thought were the most likely possibilities. Not that any of us really know very, very well how this will play out. Really, only the two presidential candidates have a real good feel for who they'll be picking.
So, John, we also asked about some of the Clinton controversies and which ones bother the voters. I look at this as largely good news for you. Think about how polarized the country is. 50% say they're bothered by her Wall Street speeches, 47% the Clinton Foundation's relationship with foreign donors, and 45% the email server. You got to assume that a lot of those are Republicans in about half the country or less. seems to me that shows those numbers could be a lot higher than they are, and that's, I think, basically good news for her. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'd be inclined to agree. I think on the email issue in particular, there's a certain amount of fatigue. It's been talked about so much and for so long that unless another major development breaks in the story, I think a lot of Americans are saying, okay, it's sort of been discussed. Not that, like you say, Republicans view it as a huge issue. Some independents will. But in the broad electorate, when we look at the entire scope of who's going to vote in this election, it does not seem to be a massive issue at this time for most people.
Casey, welcome. Good to see you. I know you've been with you've been with Secretary Clinton for a while now. Just give us a sense that everything about this show, and not just this show, has been all bad for Donald Trump, all good for Hillary Clinton. How are the people around her feeling at this moment about the state of the race?
I think that they're feeling pretty good, frankly, John. I think that they're seeing over the course of the last couple of weeks borne out exactly what they were saying when the tide was shifting in Donald Trump's favor, back when he seemed like a winner, when people were talking a lot about his Rust Belt strategy and all of the ways he was going to change the electorate potentially. And they were arguing, look, the fundamentals are with us. They are not with him. You're going to see this race change once Democrats come home and Bernie Sanders gets out of the race, or at least the party unifies, and you're seeing that start to happen. And I think privately, Clinton aides also feel that the events of the last week have served to mitigate some of her weaknesses, or what were perceived as potential weaknesses, namely her caution. That, of course, is something that's sort of been portrayed as political calculation in the way that this election cycle has gone previously, especially for many of the Republicans, for example, who ran against Trump. That didn't seem to work. I think now, with the way things have played out after Orlando, they feel like her caution is turning into a strength, which is a big deal.
Casey, quickly, just talk about Secretary Clinton in this USA Today interview and weigh in on this issue of Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Is she just being cautious there, or do you think it's a possibility that she'd consider removing her?
I get the sense that they don't want to do anything right now to put a foot wrong with Bernie Sanders, so I do think that they're trying to be very careful around that. But I will say that I was surprised by how far she went in saying that she wants a new party, basically. She used the word new to say how she wants Democrats to move forward. That suggests to me that, they could be serious about this. And, I think at the end of the day, they do want Bernie Sanders to fold back into the tent. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Debbie Wasserman Schultz becomes a casualty of that.
Okay, Casey out in Virginia, John McCormick in Illinois. Thank you both. Up next, we'll talk about Donald Trump's war against the media and his recent blacklisting of the old Washington Post with Jim Rutenberg of Ye Old New York Times right after this.
next guest wrote his latest column about Donald Trump, and he's hoping to still be able to get credentials to Trump's campaign events. After Donald Trump announced that he was banning the Washington Post from his rallies, media columnist for the New York Times, Jim Rutenberg, published a story, came out yesterday, on Trump's role as the media punisher-in-chief. Rutenberg himself, there he is, Jim, hey-o.
Hey.
Thanks for coming on the show, is with us here. So tell us about these encounters, these telephonic encounters you've been having with Donald Trump.
Well, I'll tell you that I've been covering politics not as long as you esteemed gentlemen, but quite a long time. And I've never had a situation like this where you call and you say, what's the strategy? What's the thinking? Let me talk to your pollster or your ad person. And no, Mr. Trump will call you momentarily. And there he is on the phone.
So this is a hard thing for press because we don't like to be part of the story, but the Washington Post now is absolutely part of the story.
Yes.
In your sense of talking to Trump for a while about this, did you get the sense that he appreciates the balance of freedom of the press that's going on here, or is he just unapologetically, his view is, I can kick anybody else I want, these are private events?
I think it's somewhere in between. Right? He's unapologetic. He's actually doubling down, and he told me the New York Times might be next on his list. His thing, and it definitely plays to a crowd, however I think he thinks it, I don't think this is all strategy, is if they're not being fair, if I don't like what they're writing, and I think I'll take a bad story, but if I think it's unfair or I think it's inaccurate, then I have the right to cut them off as a candidate.
But he's just working the refs, right? He's just trying to intimidate people. I know some of his supporters like it, but isn't this an attempt to try to intimidate reporters from writing negative stories?
All of my programming as a reporter and all of my experience as a reporter would say yes. Yeah. But again, with Donald Trump, I never know because he definitely seems to be, there's some emotion involved and he seems to get angry and it seems genuine at the same time, but maybe he's also a showman, so I don't know.
Jim, you asked the obvious question, which is asked him whether he would impose similar kinds of bans, do similar things if he were elected president of the United States. Right. Trump came back and he said, that's different from me taking something away. There, I'm taking something away where I'm representing the nation. I don't really understand the quotes, but he basically is saying they were kind of hard to parse what he was actually saying. But I seem to think what he was saying was, I'll be different when I'm president.
Public versus private.
Public versus private. He said something about that these are events held on private property, et cetera, et cetera. Well, did you have any sense that we should believe him? That he would suddenly be a different person if he were president of the United States and that he wouldn't try to intimidate the press in this way?
What's the line in those stock commercials, like past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results? I don't know.
Jim Cramer, welcome to the set.
I mean, you guys have, you guys have a story today where Republicans in the Senate said we thought after he sort of was all but the presumed nominee, he would change his behavior. He didn't. They feel disappointed. So that's a case where he said he was going to get so presidential we wouldn't believe it, and he didn't. But, he says the White House will be different. He's right. And what he meant to say was, I'm representing the nation, not myself. Right. Is what he was meant to say.
Would you like to see other news organizations, including yours and ours, say, if the Washington Post and others are going to be denied credentials in solidarity, we won't cover you?
I thought about that when I was writing this column. Would I think that? And I guess I sort of don't. We should have solidarity. He should let the Post cover him, and we should all make a lot of noise about it. At the same time, we can't cut off covering the presumed nominee of one of the two major parties or any major party. I mean, it doesn't. If the third party candidate shows up, you have to cover him. So, if our credentials are taken away, so be it. And we stand by the Post, and I support the Post personally in this.
Do you subscribe?
I do subscribe.
Okay,
good. Do you think, real quick, Jim, do you think that Trump, do you think Trump has any sense that when he threatens Jeff Bezos the way he does, that he might be over a line? Real quick.
I think that is, and I'd asked him this, I think it's chilling. And I told him, don't you think this is chilling? I do think it's chilling. I told him that. That's why I ended the column, B-R-R-R-R. Grr.
Jim Rutenberg. Ew.
Hey.
Thanks for stopping by. We'll be right back.
You love polls, we got polls.
Oh, we got
plenty more from our national poll on our website, BloombergPolitics.com. Check it out. Coming up on Bloomberg West, Emily Chang talks to the CEO of Take-Two Interactive and the president of Nintendo America. With all due respect, is back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. Egypt's aviation ministry says a search ship has spotted wreckage of the Egypt airplane that crashed into the Mediterranean last month, killing all 66 people on board. The plane disappeared from radar en route to Cairo from Paris. A new Bloomberg Politics poll shows Democrat Hillary Clinton opening up a double-digit lead, 49% to 37%, over Republican Donald Trump. 50% of those surveyed say they would never vote for Trump. By a 50 to 45 margin, voters say Trump would do a better job fighting terrorism. In the United States Senate, Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy today launched a filibuster to force a vote on gun control legislation.
Having come through the experience of Newtown, I've had enough. It's been 4 years, and nothing has been done, despite the fact that 90